In this video series, we're going to cover Unholy Death Knights. Let's begin by looking at stats and reforging. As you can see from the stats equation, strength is the most important stat, followed by hit rating and haste. Let's take a look at reforging. You'll have a couple of objectives when reforging. The first one is to reach the hit cap of either 6% for heroics or 8% for raids. Your next objective will be to maximize haste. Reforge crit first and mastery second into haste. Let's take a look at some useful gems for Unholy Death Knights. You can see a list of relevant gems that you can use to socket your gear. As a rule of thumb, you'll want to socket your gear with pure strength. The Bold Inferno Ruby gems are the plus 40 strength, unless the socket bonus is plus 20 strength. Let's take a look at some effective glyphs for Unholy Death Knights, starting with recommended prime glyphs. The first one we're going to look at is a Glyph of Raised Dead. What it does is it causes your ghoul to receive an additional 40% of your strength and 40% of your stamina. Now the other effective prime glyphs are divided into two categories. Glyphs that are effective for single target rotations and glyphs that are effective for AoE rotations. The ones I went with are the effective single target rotation glyphs, those being the Glyph of Scourge Strike and the Glyph of Death Coil. If you want to have more effective AoE DPS, you'll want to go with the Glyph of Icy Touch and the Glyph of Death and Decay. Let's take a look at some effective major glyphs for Unholy Death Knights. The recommended three major glyphs are the Glyph of Anti-Magic Shell, the Glyph of Blood Boil, and the third one is actually not the Glyph of Darksucker. Instead, it's the Glyph of Pestilence. The reason why is that as an Unholy Death Knight, your Pestilence does a lot more damage. We'll talk about that in the talents discussion in just a moment. So, as you can see, I don't have the Pestilence glyph just yet, but I'm going to go ahead and buy it and switch it out with the Glyph of Darksucker. Let's move on to a talent discussion for Unholy talents. Like the talent discussions in the other tutorials, we're not going to talk about every individual talent. Instead, we're going to talk about the more interesting ones. Let's begin our talent discussion by looking at the talents that empower your diseases. Starting with, it's called Virulence. We have 3 points here. This increases the damage of your diseases by 30%. Epidemic is another disease-enhancing talent that increases the duration of Blood Plague and Frost Fever by 12 seconds. Contagion is a really great talent, and the reason why is without the Contagion talent, your Pestilence will spread the diseases on the target, but those diseases that are spread will do 50% less damage. With 2 points in Contagion, whenever you spread diseases, they do the full 100% damage, which is great to have. And the last talent that we want to look at that empowers your diseases is called Ebon Plaguebringer. The way this works is it enhances various attack abilities like Plague Strike, Icy Touch, Chains of Ice, and Outbreak, such that whenever they land, they will infect the target with another disease called Ebon Plague. And this does two things. It increases the damage taken by your diseases by a whopping 30%, and it also debuffs a target so that any magical damage that it incurs is increased by 8%. So it's an absolutely essential Unholy talent. Another emphasis of the Unholy talent tree that we want to look at in a little bit more detail is its emphasis on empowering your Death Coil ability. Let's look at Unholy Blight. What this does is anytime you cast Death Coil, it will infect the target with a swarm of unholy insects, taking 10% of the damage done by the Death Coil. And what this does, it creates a dot. This Unholy Blight becomes a dot that lasts 10 seconds. It also prevents the diseases from being dispelled on the target. Shadow Infusion is another Death Coil empowering talent. As you can see, what it does is anytime you cast Death Coil, it empowers your ghoul by giving it a buff that increases its damage dealt by 6% for 30 seconds. It also stacks up to 5 times. And the third Death Coil talent in the Unholy tree is called Sudden Doom. This is one of your proccing talents. It gives your auto attacks a chance to create the Sudden Doom buff that causes your next Death Coil to be free of runic power. And the last talent we want to take a look at in the Unholy tree is called Dark Transformation. As you can see, it extends from the Shadow Infusion talent. Now, as we described a moment ago, the way Shadow Infusion works is every time you cast Death Coil, it buffs your ghoul with a stack of Shadow Infusion, which can stack up to 5 times. Now, as soon as it reaches 5 stacks, Dark Transformation will activate. When you use Dark Transformation, it turns your ghoul into this monstrosity that does a ton of damage. Now we'll talk about where Dark Transformation fits into both your single target and AoE rotations later in the tutorial. And that wraps up our talent discussion for Unholy Death Knights. Now we're going to move into discussion about the single target and AoE rotations for Unholy Death Knights.